On paper, the natural geopolitical impulse should have brought Russia and Britain to blows. The Russians coveted the Baltic states and wanted a sphere of influence in the Mediterranean from which to attack its traditional enemy, Turkey. There were persistent demands, which Napoleon encouraged, that Russia be allowed to occupy Malta. But Britain did not want the Baltic supplies of timber, tar and hemp, crucial for the Royal Navy, in Russian hands, and it was a tradition of British foreign policy to support the sick man of Europe. Moreover, British commercial interests were adamant that Malta could not be given up. Additionally, Tsar Alexander I, on acceding in R8 encouraged a culture of Anglomania and made it plain that he intended to fulfill the long-standing Russian desire to be a major diplomatic player in Europe. Some said Alexander inherited an acute inferiority complex about the West. The murder of Enghien in I-804 finally tipped the balance against Napoleon, for Alexander considered it a personal affront. He had set himself up as self-appointed leader and spokesman for Europe's crowned heads. The British cunningly encouraged the Tsar to shift his Mediterranean interest towards Italy, the Levant and modern Yugoslavia, which Napoleon regarded as his sphere of influence and where he was unwilling to make concessions. And money finally did the trick. Alexander could not resist the financial deal struck with Britain, whereby Russia received PSI 2S00 a year for every troop she put in the field, since the Third Coalition would start a process whereby Russia became virtually supreme arbiter in Europe by I-8IS. And since Napoleon is often facilely bracketed with Hitler, it is worth dwelling on the geopolitics of all this and separating fact from propaganda. Napoleon's foolish intransigence and his desire to have a finger in every pie in I-8OS was rightly condemned by Talleyrand, who saw where it would all lead. But we should also be aware of the humbug and hypocrisy in the Third Coalition. Why was a simple demand like natural frontiers by France regarded as unacceptable by Britain, yet Russian meddling in the Mediterranean was justified? Why was Russian seizure of Corfu as a salter for Malta not portrayed as warmongering by a British press always so eager to detect all such manifestations? Horror was expressed when Russia made itself a European power in I-945, but the prospect was viewed with complacency in I-80SI5. Special pleading was never seen to such good effect as in the justifications by Britain for Russian expansionism after I-8OS. By April I-8OS, British diplomacy had smoothed away Russian distrust of London's intentions in the eastern Mediterranean, and, after extremely difficult negotiations between Pitt and Novosiltsov, an Anglo-Russian alliance was completed on April at St. Petersburg. Austria, initially reluctant to join an anti-French coalition if Prussia remained neutral, was inveigled into Pitt's web after Napoleon's coronation in Milan. Many Austrians, including General Mack, were confident they could beat France in a new war, so in June Vienna's Aulic Council began making overtures to Pitt. In August I-8OS, Austria formally protested to Napoleon over his seizure of Savoy, and a treaty of alliance was then signed with Pitt and Alexander. Talleyrand performed sterling service in keeping Prussia neutral, which he did by making over Hanover. So the Third Coalition was in being. It was an unwieldy alliance, where all three partners were motivated by different raisons d'etat, and where personal feelings also entered into play. Pitt was involved in an anti-Bonaparte crusade. Tsar Alexander was moved by megalomania and jealousy of Napoleon, and the Austrian aristocracy by a patrician distaste for the new upstart empire and its bogus nobility. The overt aims of the Third Coalition, which was soon supplemented by Sweden and the Kingdom of Naples, were to expel France from Hanover, Holland and North Germany, to clear the French out of Switzerland, northern Italy and Naples. The covert aims, divulged only in secret clauses of the Treaty of Alliance, were to deny France the natural frontiers and to restrict her to the borders as in 1791. The ultimate aim, of course, was to return Europe to the pre-1789 world of the ancient regime. On paper, Napoleon faced a formidable array of enemies. Since the Austrian army was 250,000 strong, the Russians were expected to put another 200,000 in the field, and incursions in peripheral roles could be expected from the Swedes, Neapolitans and British, perhaps providing another 50,000 troops in all. Quite undaunted by the odds, Napoleon reveled in the prospect of new battles. On the 25th of August he sent Murat to Germany on a secret reconnaissance mission, and the same day wrote to Talleyrand, "The die is cast. The operation has begun. On the 17th I will be in Germany with 200,000 men." But he had jumped the gun, for there were factors he had overlooked. The outbreak of a general European war provoked a crisis at the Bank of France. Rumors were rife that Napoleon had emptied the bank's coffers when he left on campaign. The ensuing panic increased the embarrassment of a bank which had already been compromised by an unwise speculation in Mexican piasters by the Ministry for the Treasury. A low tax yield in R804 left the state unprepared for the heavy expenses of the Grand Army on active campaign. Moreover, the R806 economic depression in France was widely blamed on the general crisis of confidence arising from the unpopular return to large-scale continental hostilities. Napoleon was caught in a dilemma between needing a quick military victory to restore public confidence and needing to return to Paris to put the economy on a proper footing before he could begin campaigning. He had an additional technical problem about conscription, since he intended to call up 80,000 men in advance of the legal age of 20. Leaving Boulogne on the 3rd of September, he arrived in Paris 2 days later and was obliged to spend 3 weeks there, passing emergency measures that would enable his military plans to mature. His conscription proposals were intensely unpopular both with the public and the legislature, and to get his way the emperor had to rush through the necessary legislation by senatus consultum. He was now ready for the campaign itself. He planned to hit the Austrians hard before the Russians had time to join them, and to do this he needed to get 10,000 troops to the Danube as fast as possible. There would be 7 corps, each of which originally contained between 2 and 4 infantry divisions, a brigade or division of cavalry, about 40 cannon, plus engineers and backup troops. In addition to the 7 corps, he would dispose of a cavalry reserve of 2 divisions of cuirassiers, 4 of mounted dragoons and 1 each of dismounted dragoons and light cavalry. Altogether there would be 22,000 horsemen plus an artillery reserve of 24 guns, or a quarter of the total cannon in the army. Over and above this was the Grand Reserve, comprising the Imperial Guard and various detachments of elite grenadiers, including second-line troops. The Grand Army probably had a total strength of 350,000 in 1805. Now was revealed the happy accident of the troop build-up at Boulogne for the invasion of England. This in itself should have alerted the Austrians, who continued to think, despite all the evidence, that the main theater of operations for the coming campaign would be in Italy. They seemed to imagine that this was Napoleon's chosen terrain, overlooking or forgetting that in 1796 and 1800 it was pure force of circumstances that made Napoleon fight in Italy. In those campaigns there were rival generals like Murat in the Rhine-Danube theater, but in 1805 they were no more, and the emperor had a clear field to himself. Napoleon had anticipated that an Austrian strike would manifest itself either as an invasion of northern Italy or an attack on Alsace from the Danube. He had already decided to strike first and eliminate the danger on the Danube before the Russians could come up. The initial attack by the Austrians in Bavaria gave Napoleon the perfect excuse to withdraw from Boulogne without losing face. Leaving Brune in charge of the camp at Boulogne, he ordered the Grand Army to cross the Rhine on the 25th of September. He himself left Paris on the 24th, and, traveling via Nancy, was in Strasbourg on the 26th. The 7 corps were commanded by Bernadotte, Marmont, Devout, Soult, Lannes, Ney and Augereau, with a cavalry reserve under Murat, and the entire force marched on the Rhine in well-planned itineraries which had been the object of Murat's secret mission the month before. The Austrians played into his hands by assuming that the main French effort would still come in Italy, and by miscalculating how long it would take the Russians to join them. In contrast to the streamlined efficiency of Napoleon's army, the Allied chain of command was poor. The Russian commander Kutuzov was instructed by the Tsar to take orders from the Austrian Emperor Francis, but not from any other Austrian general. Even within the Austrian army the chain of command was unclear, as the Emperor Francis left it vague whether General Mack or Archduke Ferdinand should have the final say. Meanwhile, everything about Napoleon's plans worked like clockwork. His strategy was to wheel south and envelop Mack's army, after which he would turn and deal with the Russians. Messina would hold the ring in Italy, and there would be smaller armies in Naples and Boulogne to deal with any Allied descents there. But the showpiece of the campaign was to be the lightning advance on the Danube. It should be emphasized that nothing like this had ever before been attempted in the history of warfare. The great French captain of the 17th century, the Vicomte de Turenne, had an axiom that great strategic movements could be attempted with a maximum of 0 men only, and Marlborough's famous dash to the Danube in 1704 involved no more than 40,000. The originality of Napoleon's conception was to attempt the war of movement with large numbers. It was to solve this conundrum that he divided his army of ZW0 into 7 independent corps. The left wing of the Grand Army moved out from Hanover and Utrecht to the rendezvous at Württemberg, while the center and right, from the Channel ports, converged on Mannheim and Strasbourg on the Middle Rhine. The vast host made for splendid viewing, presenting a panorama of different units, and a riot of corresponding color. There were lancers in red shapkas and white plumes 18 inches long, chasseurs in kalbaks with plumes of green and scarlet, hussars in shakos and plumes, dragoons in tiger-skin turbans, cuirassiers in steel helmets with copper crests, and horsehair manes, carabineers in dazzling white with classically styled helmets. The grenadiers of the Old Guard were especially impressive in their long blue coats and massive bearskins with powdered coifs and gold earrings. The Grand Army was a gallimaufry of fringes, buttons, epaulettes, braids, stripes, leather and fur trimmings, all in a kaleidoscope of colors: scarlet, purple, yellow, blue, gold and silver. The entire army then crossed the river, and, while Murat's cavalry feinted towards the Black Forest to bamboozle Mack, the 7 army corps swept through Germany for a final rendezvous on the Danube, aimed at cutting the Austrian communications. Each corps was routed along a separate line of march, thus avoiding congestion and pressure on food supplies. As always in the Napoleonic system, the corps were within 1 to 2 days' march of each other. Every day Napoleon liked to ride out on a tour of inspection, accompanied by his chief of staff Berthier, Caulaincourt, his master of horse, and Bader d'Albe, the head of the topographic unit. Others in the immediate entourage were the duty marshal of the day, 2 aides, 2 orderly officers, an equerry, a page, and a soldier carrying the portfolio containing maps and compasses. Also present were Roustam and an interpreter. Slightly ahead of the main party rode 2 more orderlies and an officer commanding a dozen cavalrymen. About 1,000 yards behind the retinue lurked the main escort, 4 squadrons of guard cavalry. At first morale in his army was high, but it was dampened later when the weather broke. Performing prodigies of marching, some 20 miles a day, the Grand Army normally completed its day's trek by noon. Having started at 4:05 am, the afternoon would be spent foraging before the earliest of early nights. French staff work was brilliant and the enemy was left confused, unable to work out from the movements of discrete corps what was their likely ultimate objective. The speed and secrecy of the advance were such that within 20 days the army was at Mayence and crossed the Danube without opposition. By traveling through the valley of the Main and via Donauwörth on the Danube, Napoleon cut off Mack's retreat. Beaten at Elchingen on the 14th of October and falling back generally after a few more sharp engagements, Mack realized too late that he was in a trap and would not be relieved by the Russians. He surrendered with S-0 men at Ulm on the 20th of October, the day before Trafalgar. At a stroke Napoleon was able to restore morale and business confidence in Paris. His bulletins, explaining and justifying the military operations, turned the Grand Army into a thing of legend and its exploits were read to spellbound audiences by actors, teachers, priests and town officials. The myth of a national army was born, but the Grand Army was always the emperor's personal instrument. Nor was the campaign as streamlined as in the Bonapartist propaganda version. The supply line held up well, there were ample boots and pay was prompt, but by November there were 8,000 soldiers on the sick list and large numbers of horses had perished because of the pace of advance. The men were tired, and Napoleon himself confessed to Josephine in a letter on the 19th of October that he had never been so exhausted. More worrying was the widespread theft and indiscipline in the army, which reached such proportions that by the 25th of November the emperor was forced to set up military commissions with summary powers. Napoleon's next objective was Kutuzov and the Russians. By threatening Vienna he would force the Allies to concentrate there. But Kutuzov refused to be gulled into a defense of the Austrian capital that would hand the initiative to Napoleon and so retreated, forcing Archduke Frederick to go with him. For the first time Napoleon's well-laid plans began to go awry. Murat the glory hunter set out with his cavalry to be the first in Vienna instead of harassing Kutuzov, and earned the emperor's angry censure. Bernadotte, whether through incompetence or conscious treachery, brought his corps across the Danube a day late, thus vitiating Napoleon's clever plan for the encirclement of Kutuzov. French honor was restored by Mortier who, with General Dupont, fought a numerically superior Russian force to a standstill at Durenstein. But, as with all French battles with the Russians, this one was marked by its heavy casualties, 3,000 on the French side against 4,000 Russians. On the 12th of November Murat and his riders reached Vienna. There was no resistance as the Austrians had declared it an open city. While the Grand Army took possession of Sioux cannon, R-0 muskets and a huge cache of ammunition, the emperor, arriving on RS November, amused himself by spending the night with an Austrian beauty. They conversed in the language of love, since she spoke no French and Napoleon no German. But by the 23rd of November the emperor was forced to rest the Grand Army. The troops who had campaigned non-stop for 8 weeks were exhausted and on the point of cracking. The critical point of the entire strategic operation had now been reached. French lines of communication were stretched taut and likely to snap if the Russians retreated any farther. On the other hand, there was an abiding danger that the Archduke Charles might retreat from the Italian front and link up with the Russians on the Danube. There were also fears that Prussia was about to enter the war on the Allied side, and any retreat by the French, be it never so strategic, could be construed as a defeat and thus give Berlin the final nudge. Lacking the resources to envelop the enemy, Napoleon had to tempt them to attack by feigning weakness. Learning that Kutuzov had retreated north towards Olmütz, where he linked up with the Second Russian Army under General Buxhowden, Napoleon sent 1/3 of his army, under Soult, Lannes and Murat, to occupy the village of Austerlitz, east of Brunn in Bohemia, and the nearby Pratzen Heights. Having thinned his army to 53,000, a tempting target for the 89,000-strong Allies, Napoleon laid plans for the rapid arrival of 22,000 reinforcements who would come on the scene of the intended battle by forced marches. He gave every sign of being weak and having overreached himself. When the Austrian Emperor Francis offered an armistice on the 27th of November, Napoleon appeared almost pathetically eager to accept. The French envoy to the parley in the Austrian camp reported the Allies seriously divided, with the Emperor Francis and Kutuzov cautious, but the Tsar and most of the Austrian generals keen to strike. On the 28th of November, Napoleon made the bait almost irresistible by ordering Soult to pull out of Austerlitz and the Pratzen Heights. Pursuing his career as great actor, the emperor next agreed to an interview with the Russian emissary Count Dolgoraki, in which he feigned confusion, uncertainty and an ill-disguised fear. So brilliantly was he toying with the enemy and so confident of his own mastery that he had actually chosen his battleground on the 21st of November. Since he lacked the numbers to envelop the enemy, the final piece in his chessboard of disinformation involved tricking the enemy into uncovering their rear. He gambled that uncovering his own line of retreat by the withdrawal from the Pratzen Heights would lead the Allies to expose their rear. He was in good spirits, which not even terrible falls of snow and hail could dampen. His chamberlain Alexander III recorded that there was an enthusiastic dinner conversation about the Egyptian campaign. Scenting victory, the Allies advanced southwest towards Brunn and occupied the Pratzen Heights unopposed on December. That night both armies camped within sight of each other by the Bosnitz and Goldbach rivers. Unknown to the Allies, Bernadotte's I Corps arrived on December, while the leading division of Devout's III Corps got to within striking distance that night by covering the 60 miles from Vienna in under 72 hours. Napoleon used his cavalry as a screen so that the enemy could not detect the arrival of these reinforcements. He drew up his army so that the Allies would be tempted to attack him on the right. He placed most of the army, spearheaded by Lanz's V Corps, on his left and center, with Bernadotte's corps concealed behind it. Other units placed here were Murat's cavalry, Oudenot's grenadiers and part of Soult's IV Corps under Generals Vandamme and St. Hilaire. Strung out on the right, holding down very extended positions, were the men of Soult's 3rd Division under General Legrand, covered by Devout's unsuspected force. The bait was obvious, and perhaps too obvious, but the Allies took it. The night of the 2nd of December was long, dark and cold. Few slept, and Napoleon's men assuaged the boredom and waiting by holding a torchlight procession to commemorate the anniversary of his coronation. Third recorded that at dinner, which the emperor sat down to at 5 p.m. in the thickening gloom, Napoleon's conversation was the most animated he had ever witnessed. On the Pratzen the Allies held their final conference. The elderly Kutuzov took no part but slept right through it. Deprived of the support of the aged Russian general, the cautious Emperor Francis could make no headway against the hotheads led by the 28-year-old Tsar Alexander and the Austrian General Weyrother. It was decided to make an all-out assault on the weak French right with 45,000 men under Buxhowden, detaching troops from the center and the Allied right for the purpose. The idea was to cut off the French retreat to Vienna. The Russian General Bagration was given the lesser task of pinning Lanz's V Corps in its defensive position on Santon Hill. The enemy had thus fallen into Napoleon's trap. They would find the French right a tougher nut than expected, and they had denuded their own center. Dawn broke on the 2nd of December to reveal dense fog. Napoleon mounted his Arab horse and gave orders that every unit had to keep 5 spare horses ready in case the imperial staff needed them. It was one of those days when the weather dictated that all messages would have to be sent by horseback. Under normal weather conditions, a semaphore system conveyed intelligence at a rate of 120 meters (ph). The Russians began their great enveloping move at 4 a.m. and, after some confusion in the mist, attained their initial objectives by taking the villages of Sokolnitz and Telitz. At 8 a.m. the surprise force of Devout's 7,000 men counterattacked, causing a bewildered Buxhowden to summon reinforcements from the Pratzen Heights. In response, Napoleon ordered Oudenot's grenadiers to further strengthen the right, then checked that Lanz and Bernadotte were holding their own on the left. Satisfied on that score, Napoleon next unleashed Murat's cavalry against the Russian horse. A massive encounter embroiling 1 horseman ensued, from which Murat emerged triumphant. Now seemed the moment to release Soult's 2 divisions against the Pratzen, but such was Napoleon's superb sense of timing and his sublime confidence that he held off a while. "How long will it take you to storm the heights?" he asked Soult. 20 minutes, sire, replied the marshal. "Very well," said the emperor. "We will wait another quarter of an hour." Napoleon's military genius was never more evident. By intuition he knew the exact equilibrium point at which the Pratzen would be sufficiently clear of Allied troops to make Soult's task easy, but not yet so denuded that reinforcements from the heights were likely to overwhelm the hard-pressed French right. At last, at 9 a.m. he gave the signal. The sun came out, and out of the fog came Napoleon's trump card, their bayonets glistening in the sunlight. Too late, Kutuzov realized what was about to happen and frantically tried to recall his men from the left. To make absolutely sure there was no hitch, Napoleon called Bernadotte over from the left and sent him in Soult's wake. After heavy fighting, the French were again in possession of the heights by midday, and had beaten off a succession of frenzied attacks from the Russians, commencing around 10:30. In desperation, Kutuzov asked his elite troops for one last effort. 0 men of the Russian Guard Corps streamed up the hill at 1 p.m. At first they made ground, but were soon outflanked by a combination of the cavalry of Bessiers's Imperial Guard and one of Bernadotte's divisions. Crushed, the Russians scurried away down the hill, leaving Napoleon the master of Pratzen and the battlefield. he had effectively cut the Allied army in half. As the shades of a winter evening began to appear, victory turned to rout. Napoleon moved the Imperial Guard onto the Pratzen and swung Soult's men south to the edge of the heights. He then brought up cannon and from 3.30 on began to shoot holes in the ice of the frozen lakes around the Pratzen, making great watery craters. Many of Buxhouden's men were drowned in them as the Russians attempted a panic-stricken escape. Bagration retreated ignominiously from his assault on the French left, and the Allied monarchs left the field in despondency and confusion. At Austerlitz, Napoleon won his most perfect victory. This battle was to him what Gaugamela had been to Alexander, Cannae to Hannibal, and Alesia to Julius Caesar. For the loss of 305 French dead and 6,940 wounded he had inflicted 0 Russian casualties and 4,000 Austrian, captured 40 colors and taken 180 cannon. There was the same discrepancy in prisoners, 573 French as against 2,000 Allied captives. The superstitious Napoleon thereafter considered the 2nd of December one of his lucky dates, but there are those who say that, consciously or unconsciously, he delayed the fighting of a battle which could have happened earlier just so that he could celebrate the anniversary of his coronation with a triumph. The son of Austerlitz also became an item in Napoleon's calendar of superstitions. He thought it significant that the sun had come out as his men surged onto the Pratzen just as it had shone through the mist on the day of his coronation. Austerlitz confirmed that Napoleon was truly a great captain. Before that, it could have been claimed that he had met only second-raters. It should not be forgotten also that he had not been in a battle since Marengo 5.5 years before, so that his talent for war was obviously innate and not something that needed constant practice. Writing to Josephine the day after the battle, he was modest about his exploit. "Yesterday I beat the Russians and Austrians. I am a bit tired. I have bivouacked 8 hours in the open air, in very cold nights." He complained of a sty in his eye which he was bathing with lotions of pure water mixed with hot rose water. After their defeat, the Russians retreated pell-mell to Poland. The day after the battle, Tsar Alexander wrote to Savary as follows: "Tell your master that I am going away. Tell him that he performed miracles yesterday, that the battle has increased my admiration for him, that he is a man predestined by heaven, that it will require 100 years for my army to equal his." Napoleon thought this meant he could get a permanent settlement with Russia, but Talleyrand, knowing the scope of the emperor's ambitions and the geopolitical logic this involved, was always skeptical. The Austrian Francis too asked for an interview with Napoleon and sued for terms. The dictated Peace of Pressburg was draconian. Austria ceded Venice, Styria, and Dalmatia to the Kingdom of Italy. Swabia and the Tyrol were given to the electors of Württemberg and Bavaria. Austria undertook to pay an indemnity of 32 million francs in bills of exchange and 8 million in cash. Even more momentous were the consequences in Germany. Napoleon rewarded his marshals by giving the Grand Duchy of Berg to Murat and Neuchâtel to Berthier. The award to Murat was in recognition of his excellent reconnaissance mission in August-September raid 05 when he scouted suitable terrain under the nom de guerre of Colonel de Beaumont, not for his failure to intercept Kutuzov. As ever, the useless and treacherous Bernadotte was rewarded. Although Bernadotte had crossed the Danube a day late and had lacked energy in the pursuit of the enemy on the evening of Austerlitz, leading Devout to complain bitterly to the emperor, Napoleon saw fit once more to promote him to higher office, this time making him governor of Anspach and Prince of Pontecorvo, a tiny enclave within the Kingdom of Two Sicilies, between Sicily and Gaeta, but technically a sovereign state. Even though this donation brought Bernadotte a 200,000 franc lump sum and an annual income of 300,000 francs, Napoleon capped this by buying Moreau's house in the Rue Anjou and giving it to Bernadotte as a present. The Gascon, who had plotted with Moreau against Napoleon, had no qualms about accepting the house of his erstwhile ally from the man he had wanted to overthrow. But the perks to the marshals were the least of the ways in which Napoleon redrew the map of Germany. He promoted the electors of Bavaria and Württemberg to crowns and fused the new kingdoms, Hesse-Darmstadt and all the principalities of South and West Germany into a confederation of the Rhine, expressly designed as a vassal state of France. Based at Frankfurt, the confederation left foreign and military affairs to Napoleon. He thus fulfilled a traditional aim of French foreign policy, building a buffer between France and Central Europe. Naturally, the immediate consequence of this new alignment was to destroy the Holy Roman Empire, since only Austria, Prussia and a few northern states were left. On the 6th of August R806 the Holy Roman Empire officially ceased to exist when Francis II renounced his title of Emperor of Germany. As Francis I he retained the title Hereditary Emperor of Austria, which he had assumed in R804. Elsewhere in Europe the consequences of Austerlitz were also groundbreaking. The Bourbons of the Kingdom of Naples were punished by expulsion for having backed the wrong horse. In their place Napoleon appointed his brother Joseph as king by simple decree on the 31st of March 1806. The month before, Joseph and Messina had marched on Naples with an army of 40,000, forcing Ferdinand IV to flee to Sicily. The Neapolitan population itself reacted with indifference to the change of regime. On his February 806, King Joseph made a triumphal entry into Naples. Napoleon meanwhile upgraded the Batavian Republic to the Kingdom of Holland and put in Louis as the new king. These new kingdoms created out of nepotism created some ominous rumblings. Murat, jealous of any privilege that he himself did not possess, warned Napoleon that he was going too far, but the emperor discerned his motive and ignored him. In retaliation, Murat began to intrigue with Foch and Talleyrand. Napoleon himself did not return to Paris until the 26th of January, having spent the first 3 weeks of the new year in Munich and Stuttgart. He was greeted with enthusiasm by a Paris proud both of the great victory and the triumphalist peace that succeeded it. He was reasonably confident that the peace would hold, especially since he had placated Prussia by ceding Hanover to her. His most implacable enemy, Pitt, was dead. Allegedly, he remarked on hearing of Austerlitz, "Roll up that map of Europe. It will not be needed these 10 years, and there are even some who claim that he died of a broken heart after seeing his old enemy master of Europe." Pitt was replaced by Fox, well known for his French sympathies. Yet even a prime minister is the prisoner of entrenched financial interests, so it was not long before Fox was heard to say that he could not accept French suzerainty in Sicily. In Russia too, after a brief struggle, the Francophobe party regained the upper hand. It looked as though Talleyrand was right, and the fundamental logic of power politics would always prevail, no matter what the personal sympathies of foreign rulers. The campaign of Austerlitz saw the Grand Army in its first full appearance. It would grow in size until in 1812 some 630,000 men were mobilized, but by late 1805 Napoleon's military system was essentially what it would remain. The main features of his success were surprise, mobility, seizing and keeping the initiative, and, above all, the flexibility of the corps system, where each corps, in effect a miniature army 30,000 strong, was capable of living off the land and fighting superior enemy detachments. Clearly the personality of the emperor himself was all important. Here was a man who lived for war and told Josephine, in a letter dated the 9th of February 1806, that reading an army list was his favorite occupation and gave him most pleasure when tired. But even a military genius needs a well-oiled machine and highly motivated soldiers to carry out his brilliant schemes. Both these assets Napoleon possessed. The issue of morale is crucial. Some historians have overdone this and painted a picture of a citizens' army, fueled by revolutionary elan, sweeping away the corrupt and demoralized armies of the rotten ancient regime. But the old cliché contains some truth. It has to be conceded that social mobility, such an important feature of the revolutionary years, dried up under Napoleon. Under the Republic there had been 170 new appointments as general in a single year, but under Napoleon the highest number was 37. On the other hand, among those who would have blushed unseen in the pre-KG system were Napoleon himself, 18 of his marshals and generals like Junot, Friant, Vandamme, Montbrun and Delaborde. Half the generals and Rados had been commissioned since KG, though, as we have conceded, this hardly redounds to Napoleon's credit. The impact of the French Revolution on the level of skills and talents in the Grand Army can scarcely be denied. Importantly, French generals were usually much younger than their enemy counterparts. In Rados, the average age of generals in the Austrian army was 63. And, in the war against Prussia in Rados 6, out of 142 Prussian generals 79 were over 60 and only 13 under 50. Moreover, French officers were there on merit, whereas enemy officers were often elderly, impoverished and lieutenants who had clawed their way up from the ranks or were silly-ass young noblemen. The contrast continued into the ranks. Most of the Grand Army's soldiers had at least a year's service to their credit. They were brilliant at living off the land, their morale was high as they thought themselves invincible, and even, imbued as they were with the ideology of the French Revolution, superior to the benighted infantry of the ancient regime armies. Another aspect of the Grand Army's success was its use of skirmishers, who were highly trained and invulnerable to all but other skirmishers. Although these were shock troops and did great damage in the softening up phase of a battle, ancient regime armies were chary of using them, as they were thought too independent, too free-thinking and therefore prejudicial to discipline, and a standing invitation to desert. Until the Spanish experience in Rados 8, aristocratic regimes feared to arm the masses for a popular war against Napoleon, lest the self-same people turn their guns first against the native oligarchy. Napoleon's military machine has provoked more argument, with some regarding it as a model of how army staff work should be conducted and others finding it defective, over-elaborate, needlessly complex and productive of errors, oversights, omissions and excessive duplication. As with all Napoleon's civil and military hierarchies, the devil was in the detail. The other problem was that hardy perennial of all bureaucracies, proliferation. Beginning with 400 officers and 0 men in R8OS, the imperial headquarters swelled to 3,500 officers, and R0 men by rate RZ. Apart from the personnel of the General Commissary of Army Stores, HQ housed the Emperor's personal staff and servants and the general staff of the Grand Army. The three key men were Alexander Berthier, Minister of War and Chief of Staff of the Grand Army, Christophe Duroc, the Grand Marshal of the Palace, also in charge of the imperial household, family and servants and incidentally procurer of beautiful women for the emperor, and the Master of Horse, General Armand de Caulaincourt, later Duke of Vicenza, in charge of stables, pages, messenger services and imperial escorts. Reporting to Duroc were Constant and the other three valets, the Mameluke bodyguard Roustam, the prefect of the palace, plus secretaries, physicians, equerries, pages, butlers and servants. Because Napoleon esteemed Duroc and liked him more than any other man, he also put him in charge of liaison between the emperor's personal staff and his planning staff. However, Duroc did not oversee Napoleon's private secretaries, the channel between the emperor and his ministers, of whom the chief from 1796 are 8 ounces had been Burian, dismissed for peculation and larceny. He was replaced by Meneval. A much more long-running personality was Bader d'Albe, who served Napoleon from 1796 to Rate R3 as head of his topographical office. He was in charge of all Napoleon's military maps, where he placed different colored pins to denote battle positions. Bader d'Albe was an invariable part of the retinue that accompanied the emperor when he rode out to his vantage point to direct a battle or inspect individual units. If the general staff presented a mixed picture to contrast with the great success of the corps system, the Imperial Guard itself remained the great unknown, since Napoleon consistently refused to send it into battle, even when its appearance would probably have won the day for him. In Rate OS there was as yet only the old guard foot grenadiers, chasseurs, mounted grenadiers, dragoons, lancers, mamelukes, gendarmes d', and chasseurs à cheval, but mainly grenadiers and elite cavalry, some RZ, 0 in all. The Guard was itself a growth industry, formed from the corps of bodyguards known as the Guides, added to successively by the Guards of the Directory, the Legislative Assembly and the Consular Guard. The reconstituted Imperial Guard of December R804 contained S0 Grenadiers and Z0 Cavalry. By mid-R8OS alone there had been a 50% increase in numbers and by Rate RZ there were 56 R69 Guardsmen. The Old Guard was supplemented in R806 by the Middle Guard, formed from 2 Fusilier regiments and added to in R812-13 by 2 regiments of flankers, all crack shots. A third body, the Young Guards, was formed in 1809 from the choice recruits into the best regiments of light infantry, voltages and trailers. By 1814 the strength of the 3 sections of the Imperial Guard totaled an incredible 2,482. The minimum entry qualification was 5 years' service and 2 campaigns. Guardsmen were paid on a differential scale, guard privates were paid as ordinary sergeants, corporals as ordinary sergeant majors, and so on. Special rations, equipment and even special food completed the sense of being an elite formation. Until Rate R3 the Emperor would never send this crack corps into battle, and even then he held back his beloved Old Guard. Some said he thereby took the edge off the fighting caliber of the Guard, so that when it was finally called on to perform, it bore itself with lackluster. Others complained that it was absurd to hold a huge, overmanned body in permanent reserve when the regiments doing the actual fighting had thereby been drained of their best manpower. Such was the Grand Army that won Austerlitz. Many students of Napoleon consider it a supreme irony that he should have brought his armies to such a pitch of perfection at the very time a misguided foreign policy meant that all their valor would ultimately be in vain. If there are those who think Napoleon began to go wrong at Luneville and Amiens, there are many more who think that Austerlitz was the turning point, the moment when a traditional French foreign policy became a purely personal Napoleonic one. The key error was the construction of the Confederation of the Rhine, which meant that a lasting settlement with Austria and Prussia would never be possible. Sooner or later, given Tsar Alexander's conception of his position, Prussia, Austria and Russia were bound to unite, in which case not even Napoleon would be able to resist them. It is thus that we may appreciate the truth of Pyotr Jail's words: Napoleon's wars were his own wars, made inevitable by his measureless greed for power, wars which never served the interest of France, wars for which the deceived and all too patient nation paid with the blood of its sons and in the end with the territorial gains won by the Republic.